All right, let's dive into a genuine historical whodunit. We're talking about one of the most furious letters ever written, the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians. For 2,000 years, pretty much everyone thought they knew who Paul was so angry at. But what if that was a case of mistaken identity? What if the real culprits have been hiding in plain sight this whole time?
Our investigation starts with the raw, unfiltered anchor that just explodes off the page of this ancient letter. Seriously, this is not some polite theological disagreement. This is a declaration of war. And that sets up our central mystery. I mean, just listen to this. Paul wishes his enemies were, well, castrated. He curses anyone, even an angel from heaven, who preaches a different message. He says they bewitched his followers. This is personal. This is visceral. This is absolute fury.
So you have to ask, right? Who on earth were these opponents? What could they possibly have done to provoke this kind of extreme reaction? This is the question that kicks off our entire investigation, and it's one of early Christianity's most fascinating cold cases. Okay, so let's meet our first and, for a long time, our only suspects. This is the group that history has traditionally blamed. The Judaizers. The classic theory is pretty simple, and it makes sense on the surface. It says that these opponents were other Jewish Christians, and they were basically following Paul around, telling his new non-Jewish converts, hey, it's great you believe in Jesus, but to really be in, you have to get circumcised and follow all the Jewish laws. And look, at first glance, the case against them seems solid. Paul spends the whole letter arguing against circumcision and the law, which is exactly what the Judaizers were supposedly pushing. It's the oldest theory out there, and for hundreds of years, it really did feel like an open and shut case. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, when you start to look closer at the actual clues, the weird little details inside Paul's letter, the whole Judaizer theory starts to crumble. Now, as the problems with that first theory started piling up, scholars began looking for another culprit. Enter the Gnostics. These were entirely different groups who thought salvation came from secret mystical knowledge. As you can see, they're basically the polar opposite of the law and order Judaizers. The problem, as we're about to find out, is that neither of these suspects really fits the crime scene. Okay, here's where the case hits a wall. When you take the specific, bizarre clues from the letter and try to match them to our suspects, nothing lines up. Paul talks about worshiping elemental spirits. That doesn't fit either group. He defends himself against the charge that he's dependent on Jerusalem, which makes no sense if his opponents were Judaizers who respected Jerusalem. And maybe the weirdest clue of all, he accuses these guys who are pushing the law of not even keeping the law themselves. The evidence just doesn't fit. And this is where the investigation just stalled out for, well, centuries. With both of the main theories full of holes, the real identity of Paul's enemies was a frustratingly cold case. It was a puzzle that, it seemed, just couldn't be solved. But what if we've been looking for the bad guys in the wrong century this whole time? This is where our investigation takes a radical turn, all thanks to a really mind-bending new theory. So this new theory proposes something truly wild. What if the letter to the Galatians wasn't written by Paul in the first century? What if it's actually from the second century, written nearly 100 years after he died? Now, this brings up this fascinating ancient practice called pseudoepigraphy. It sounds like a big academic word, but the idea is simple. It was actually pretty common back then to write a text in the name of a famous, respected figure, like Paul, to give your own arguments more weight, more authority. The idea is that someone in the second century was using Paul's powerful voice to fight a very different second century battle. This one change, shifting the timeline, completely reopens the case. And if we start looking for our culprits in the second century instead of the first, a brand new suspect emerges. And this one fits the evidence like a glove. So, let me introduce you to our new prime suspect, the Elchasaites. They were a unique Jewish Christian group from the second century that blended Judaism, Christianity, and some other pagan-like ideas into a really strange, one-of-a-kind belief system. Okay, remember that evidence board where nothing seemed to fit? Let's look at it again. But this time, let's plug in the Elchasaites and a second century date. And suddenly, boom, everything clicks into place.
The worship of elemental spirits? Check. They did that. A claim to a special spirit from their prophet? Check. Demanding the law, but in such a bizarre way they get accused of not keeping it? Check. Accusations of lax morality? It all starts to make perfect sense. The profile is an exact match. And the specific details are what make this so compelling. Their founder was a prophet named El-Chasai. He could easily be the mysterious troubler the letter talks about. They demanded circumcision, but cherry-picked the rest of the law. They literally invoked the stoicheia, the elements, in their rituals. To outsiders, their ethics seemed pretty relaxed. And get this, they rejected martyrdom, which perfectly fits the accusation of being enemies of the cross. It's a perfect point-by-point match. So, if this theory is right, it does a lot more than just solve a 2,000-year-old mystery. It fundamentally changes how we have to think about the first few centuries of Christianity. The letter itself is totally transformed. It's no longer a spontaneous, emotional letter from Paul to one of his beloved churches. Instead, it becomes a calculated piece of polemic, a weapon forged in a century-long war over who got to claim the legacy of the most important apostle.
And this is really why this all matters. It shows us that early Christianity wasn't this neat, tidy movement that grew in a straight line. It was a chaotic, diverse, and often nasty battlefield of ideas. You had all these different groups with wildly different beliefs, and they all claimed to be the true heirs of Jesus. And in that fight, texts like Galatians weren't just scripture, they were ammunition, created to define one group by attacking and demonizing another.
And that just leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. If a foundational document like Galatians could actually be something so dramatically different from what we always thought, it forces us to ask, what other facts of history are just stories written by the winners, waiting for someone to reopen the case file? It's a powerful reminder that history is never really over.